So again, my name's Jim Schwartz. I'm the agronomy education lead here for 360 Yield Center. Let's talk about nitrogen. This first slide, again, it's really the observed U.S. trends in heavy precipitation. And here's the point I'm trying to make. If you look at the last half century, we were seeing a real increase in heavy rainfall events in the U.S. All right, these are 3 to 4 inch rainfall events. And when it rains, it seems like it rains harder. When I talk to folks who've been around for a long time, they tend to agree. It seems like the events that we get, they tend to be more heavy rainfall events. Here's more data from a different source that kind of verifies that. It's basically saying that if you look at the red, there's been a 50% increase in the frequency of days with 4-inch rainfall in the upper Midwest, and that the trend is statistically significant. So we continue to see heavy rainfall events. Here's some data that I think is really interesting. This is from Iowa State Climatology, and it basically has taken all the years. If you look at the blue diamonds, that's 1893 to 1980, and the red squares are 1981 to actually up to 2014. And it shows each one of those triangles or red squares indicates a growing season. And you can see how they clump it into what you would call the standard, or I hate to use the phrase average, but here's the interesting thing. So by the way, so that the left axis is July-August precipitation, all right? The x-axis there across the bottom is May-June precipitation. So as you go bottom to top, that's dry to wet. As you go left to right, that's dry to wet. As you can see, you look at 2010, 2011, 2014, 2013, right? We just continue to have these heavy rainfall years. And of course, 2012 is an anomaly on the dry side, but we continue to see that when it rains, it seems like we have a lot of rain. So how really does that impact what we're talking about here with nitrogen? And the next slide is something I think is really important. And this data has been updated, by the way. Dr. Vine at Purdue has continued to update it, and he actually validates what he's learned. So basically, we had 2 different universities look at that. So the green, that is Purdue, and the yellow, that is University of Illinois. And what they did was they took old germplasm versus new, all right, and compared them to see if new hybrids are taking up nitrogen differently and taking up fertility differently than they used to. And what they found, and they validated it and continue to validate, is that yes, new hybrids, and it's probably because if you think about it, we're keeping the roots alive longer, we're keeping the plants healthier, they're staying alive later in the year, and because of all those things, they also are taking up fertility later in the year. But modern hybrids, so the top line in the green is old versus new germplasm, all right? You can see it, modern hybrids are taking up more fertility later in the growing season. And if you think about that rainfall I showed you, and think about nitrogen, it means we have to start managing nitrogen differently to make sure that there is enough nitrogen and fertility, not just nitrogen, but fertility, available to these plants later in the growing season when they need it. This is from a study that Dr. Bilo at University of Illinois did, and I just highlighted the red. Basically says the apparent increase in post-flowering nutrient accumulation may be attributable in part to greater dry matter production during the late reproductive development stage, which makes sense. That's kind of what we were talking about. They're staying green, we're protecting them. And then his next slide outlines kind of a conundrum, and that is as maize biomass has increased over the years, there's been an increase in macro and micronutrient uptake, right? So there's a renewed need to evaluate and match availability with timing, amount, and method of supply, which benefits production, but also without harming the environment. I opened up my my Farm World newspaper yesterday, and there's an article about nitrates in the groundwater, right? And so we've got to figure out ways to increase not only the nutrient availability later in the year, but we have to do it in a sustainable way so that we're not just dumping nitrates in the groundwater. I'm sure you all appreciate and understand that. So let's dig in and let's spend a little bit of time here talking about nitrogen. This field, maybe you, again, have heard me talk about this. This field's less than a mile from my house. And this occurred back, and you can see down in the lower right, I took this picture back in the spring of 2008. And this is a no-till grower, but he actually applies his nitrogen with Anhydrous. And He applied his nitrogen, and about 2 or 3 days after he put it on, this is actually a fairly well-drained field, fairly well-drained, and good organic matter. But he applied his nitrogen, and about 2 or 3 days after he applied it, it started raining, and it rained for, goodness, probably 10 days, hard, and didn't stop. And about 2 weeks later, then, in other words, a few days after it stopped raining, his corn started looking like this, and he called me and he said, Jim, he goes, I've lost all my nitrogen. What do I do? How do I fix the problem? How much should I put on? And so I guess my question is, if you look at this field, does he have a nitrogen problem? Well, yes and no. And we'll talk about that in a minute and explain what the correct answer is for this grower. Now, this is actually a picture from a University of Illinois Crop Insights that was taken a few years ago. And this is an adult corn plant. And this was close to flowering, and he started seeing this symptom. Now that, by the way, is nitrogen deficiency, that inverted yellow V, the bottom leaves. So the question that I got in this case was, do I have a problem? Is there something I need to do? And we'll address that a little bit later as well. But two different situations that hopefully we can have some answers for when we're done here today. So as we're going to talk today again about 3 basic fertilizer forms, right? We've got anhydrous, urea, and then UAN solutions, urea, ammonium nitrate solutions. Now there's other forms of fertility as well, ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, but really we're just going to spend our time, because for the most part, these 3 forms are the major forms. We're going to talk about their fate in the soil and how they react once we put them in our fields. All right, let's start with anhydrous. So when you put anhydrous in the soil, the ammonia molecule, which is H3, has to bind with the hydrogen molecule from water in order to form the ammonium molecule. So it takes a hydrogen, right, and it becomes ammonium, and the reason that's important is that ammonium molecule now is positively charged, your soil is negatively charged, all right, and when that happens, it's held tightly, it doesn't move. Ammonium in H4 does not move much at all in your soil. So that's what we want to happen. And I will tell you, I have seen a few instances when I used to work in Ohio. They had really dry blow sands, beach sands. There wasn't, in dry springs, there wasn't hardly enough water to even bind with the ammonia, and that they lost some nitrogen that way. But if there's any level of moisture in the soil, this will take place. Now, the other thing I want you to look at, notice that there's a hydroxyl group that forms when that water molecule is split, all right? Hydroxyl groups are what create alkaline conditions. And what you'll find, all right, and this is a little bit of the difference between ammonium and other forms, is that inside that band, so when you put that ammonia in, that band expands. And by the way, that expansion of that band is kind of driven a little bit by the amount of water and the soil type and the aggregates in the soil itself, whether it's a 6 or 7 inch band or a 4 or 5 inch band, but that band expands. And what you'll find is on the outside of that band, all right, where that ammonia is interacting with the water, you're getting these hydroxyl groups formed. So on the outside, you tend to have higher pH, and the inside, you tend to have a very low pH inside that ammonia band. And it's that dramatic swing in pHs around that band that actually helps slow the conversion of ammonia, because you have this really imbalance in pHs, and that actually slows the conversion a little bit more than other forms. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But there is a big pH swing because of those hydroxyl groups. So. All right, so back to on the left, you see that equation. That's ammonia, all right, and it grabs a hydrogen and becomes ammonium. Now, this process, this overall process that I'm showing you is called nitrification, all right? And I always ask when I do this in front of audiences, is nitrification good or bad? And the answer is yes. It's both. It's good and bad. The reason it's good is that the corn plant takes up the vast majority of its nitrogen in the nitrate form. See the NO3 over on the right? Your soils are negatively charged. Nitrate is negatively charged. And therefore, that's the form that moves readily in soil water and gets to the corn plant. So it takes up most of the nitrogen in the nitrate form. But the bad news is that's also the form that can be lost to leaching and denitrification. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, this nitrification process it's greatly reduced by cool soils. It's a biological process. So cool soils, low pH, waterlogged soils will all slow this process down. So let's walk through it. All right, so you see that ammonia grabs a hydrogen, and becomes ammonium, and there's no oxygen required in that process. Okay, so that process will take place in waterlogged soils. Now keep in mind, ammonium doesn't move that much. It's held tightly by the soil. So the only way a corn plant can take up ammonium really is the roots growing to it, and that doesn't happen. That's a very, very small percent of the nitrogen the corn plant takes up. Once it's in the ammonium form, then there's a bacteria called Nitrosomonas. And Nitrosomonas bacteria will quickly create, or I'm sorry, they will basically turn that ammonium molecule into nitrite, which is NO2, and then very quickly that nitrite will grab another oxygen, and then another bacteria called Nitrobacter will quickly turn that into nitrate. Now if you look at that part of the process, okay, that process requires oxygen, and it will not take place in a waterlogged soil. So in a really, really wet spring, if you put on anhydrous, right, and you have waterlogged soils, it'll convert to ammonium, but it won't convert to nitrate because there's no oxygen there. Now, one other thing I want to point out here, I probably should have this in there. If you notice, when we cleave hydrogens off ammonium, that actually creates free hydrogen. I don't have it in this equation, I probably should. But this is where, this nitrification process is where we get acidification in our soils because we have free hydrogen that's created. And that's what raises the pH when we apply nitrogen. So let's go back to that picture. Let's go to the next slide. Excuse me. Oops, go back, Caitlin, go back to that slide with the picture that says, have I lost? Based on what we just talked about with anhydrous, right? I said that it can it can become ammonium without oxygen, right? And ammonium's held by the soil and doesn't really move, so it doesn't get taken up by the plant. Think of the roots of these little plants. And I said the majority of nitrogen the corn plant takes up is in the nitrate form, but it's not converted to nitrate in waterlogged soils. So back to this original grower here. Does he have a nitrogen problem? Has he lost all his nitrogen? No, he doesn't have a nitrogen problem. What he's got is an oxygen problem, because what's happened, it's a no-till soil, all right? So that ammonium molecule is sitting there. It started raining like a day or two after he put it on, all right? So not much conversion occurred. It's still early spring. It's cool. And so what's happening is he hasn't lost his nitrogen. Almost all his nitrogen is sitting there in the ammonium form, and the corn plant takes most of it up in the nitrate form. So it's just not getting nitrogen. So I told this grower, actually, and I know he's a no-tiller, and I said, you've got an oxygen problem. I said, what you need to do is open your soils up, and it'll convert. And he didn't want to do that, and I talked him into doing a strip or two, and just opening the soils up with a cultivator. And when he did, guess what happened? When he opened it up and got oxygen in the soil, what do you think happened? What happened was then that ammonium and the bacteria started quickly converting the ammonium to nitrate. It was mobile, there was good moisture in the soil, and the corn greened up very, very quickly. So something to think about in a situation. So that guy didn't have a nitrogen problem. He was wanting to go throw another 50 pounds of nitrogen on, but he didn't, because all his nitrogen was sitting right there in the NH4 form because his soils were waterlogged. Now, how quickly does this process take? And there are different charts and there are different ways to look at this. But here's what I would tell you. If you go to the third row down, anhydrous ammonia in the spring, and again, there are different charts from different universities, but here's what I'm going to tell you. In about 3 to 5 weeks, and again, this is a biological process, so depending on pH, temperature, oxygen, things like that, it can go faster or slower. But I'm going to tell you 3/4 to 90% of that anhydrous applied in the spring will be in the nitrate form in 4 or 5 weeks. Okay? So that conversion, again, occurs over time, but in 4 to 6 weeks, let's say, most of it's going to be converted. And you can see the effects of stabilizers. You can see urea ammonium nitrate down at the bottom. Of course, a portion of that, 25%, is already in the nitrate form. So, and we'll talk about why do we talk about the conversion into nitrate? Because what this is, this 4 weeks, this is how many days or weeks it takes to get the ammonium into the nitrate form. In other words, 75% of ammonia is in the nitrate form. Why is that important? Why do we care about the nitrate? The reason is this. And earlier I said, is nitrification good or bad? I said yes. Well, here's why. that nitrate form over nitrate molecule on the left, that's the one the corn plant takes up. But bad things happen when we get it into the nitrate form. And that's why we care so much about regulating the timing and amount of nitrate available at any one time in our soils. Because not only can it leach, but it can go through this process called denitrification. And denitrification is the conversion of the nitrate molecule to nitrous oxide, dinitrous oxide, or pure nitrogen gas, okay? Now, there are organisms in your soil that require oxygen, okay? Some of these organisms are the ones that are breaking down residue, okay, and other organisms, and they live in your soil and they require oxygen. So when your soils get wet and they lose all the oxygen, okay, guess where they go? Because about 25% of your pore space should be occupied with oxygen, okay? About 25%. Well, when it gets waterlogged, and I'm not saying stand in water, I'm just saying waterlogged. When the 25% of the pore space that should have oxygen is replaced with water, where do you think they go to get their oxygen? They go right there to that nitrate molecule. They start cleaving off oxygen, and they create these gases that are lost into your soils, okay? So things that you can do to change this process, you can go back and you can have better drainage, good oxygen, things like that. Hey, Caitlin, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention one thing. Will you go back one slide? I'm sorry. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention is the other way we can regulate, right, the amount of nitrates at any one time is to slow this process down, okay? And we can do that with nitrification inhibitors, all right? Now, you've heard of, there's different ones. There's all kinds, and actually we're going to do a whole webinar on nitrification inhibitors. But one of them is a nitrosomonas inhibitor, okay, Inserv, all right? And what Inserv does is it basically it kills off, slows down, knocks out the population of nitrosomonas bacteria. And what happens is it takes a while for those bacteria to repopulate in your soil, and while they're repopulating, that ammonia molecule is not being converted to nitrate, okay? So that's what Inserv does. It basically knocks out the nitrosomonas bacteria in your soil and slows that conversion and keeps the ammonium in that ammonium form, which doesn't move, it doesn't leach, and therefore it takes time for those bacteria to repopulate. Now, also keep in mind that the environment in which your soils exist will drive the speed at which those bacteria will repopulate. Does that make sense? In other words, if you have a real cold, real wet, real dry, real hot environment, that's not ideal for the bacteria to repopulate. So that will also help drive how quickly or how slowly, if you use like a nitrification inhibitor, how quickly those bacteria will repopulate. But again, this is nitrification inhibitors, and that's got to keep that in mind. We'll talk about that later when we talk about nitrification inhibitors. In this case, all right, what's the problem with this guy? He actually has begun to run out of nitrogen too soon. That is, all right, textbook nitrogen deficiency. You see the inverted orange V at the leaf tip. And in this case, this is a grower who does have a problem and would need to supplement, because this was only right at tasseling. So if you look at the two situations, they may look similar. That other field I showed you in this one, but they were completely different. The other grower, he was showing nitrogen deficiencies, but he was showing nitrogen deficiency because the nitrogen was in the ammonium form, okay? This guy's showing nitrogen deficiency because his nitrates have been denitrated. This was a year where his nitrates were denitrified, and his corn crop was at a high usage time, and he had a problem. So they're two different situations, similar interpretations, but different outcomes. Let's talk about urea. That's ammonia. Now let's talk about urea, all right? So urea hydrolysis, we call it volatilization, right? This is what happens when urea is spread on top of the ground. Now the urea molecule, that's the one over on the left, the CONH22, that's urea. So when you spread it, and whether you work it in or whatever, it combines with water and it forms ammonia, right? That's basically the same chemical formula for anhydrous ammonia, which is a gas, right? So this is also a biological process, and it's driven by things like temperature, moisture, pH, and residue, all right? So it's driven by an enzyme called urease enzyme. So you can see it there. So when we talk about stabilizers, all right, I talked about nitrification inhibitors. Well, there are urease inhibitors as well that slow down the conversion of the urea molecule. And what they do is they knock out the urease enzyme and stop the urea molecule from becoming a gas. Okay, because what we want to happen is we want this molecule right here, the urea molecule on the left, we want that to get in contact with soil so that when this process does occur, the ammonia grabs hydrogen from water, becomes ammonium, and we don't lose it. So here's the deal. If you spread urea on top of your soil and it's 92 degrees and you have real heavy residue that prevents the ammonia from getting in contact with soil, right? And you have a higher balanced pH, and you do it a day after a day after a rainfall, so it's moist on top. Guess what? High temperature, good moisture, good pH, and heavy residue. You'll drive this process faster and you'll lose more. Right? So what we intend to do with a urease inhibitor, right, is slow this process down, give us a couple weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks to get a rainfall in order to move that urea in contact with soil so that when this process occurs, none of it gases off. Okay? That's the idea behind it. And by the way, I'll share this. When I was a kid, right, we used to spread urea on top of wheat and there'd be snow on the ground. Well, why could we do that? It was cold, right? It was so cold in February and March that this is a biological process that it wouldn't drive, this process would not be driven. So as that snow melted, it would take that urea molecule down in contact with the soil. Hopefully it wouldn't run off. That's the issue why we don't do it much anymore. But it was so cold. Likewise, I get the question a lot about sulfur coating on urea. All right, you see in that third bullet, pH. So what happens when that sulfur dissociates from the urea molecule is that it lowers the pH around that prill, and therefore this process has a low pH right around the prill, and it slows it down. Now, I would tell you, if you're comparing sulfur, in my opinion, this is my opinion, compare sulfur as a stabilizer, urea hydrolysis inhibitor, versus like agrotane or limus or something like that. I give sulfur maybe a 3 or a 4 versus agrotane and limus, a 9 or a 10. Those products really do what they say. It does have an impact, but it's not nearly as effective, in my opinion, as limus or agrotane or something like that. So keep in mind that urea, ammonium nitrate solutions, all right, that's what that molecule is up top. That's 28%, right? A quarter of that is ammonium, quarter of it is nitrate, and 50% of it is the urea molecule. And when we spread like 28%, really the part we're concerned about as far as hydrolysis or volatilization is the 50% that's the urea molecule. So again, when you use a UAN solution, about 3% per day is lost for each day it remains on top of the soil, assuming it's uninhabited. So again, if you let's say you take a 28 in a weed and feed and you spray it and it's heavy residue and it's 90 degrees and you have your no-tiller and you spread your lime on top, so you have high pH and it's high moisture. Well, you're going to drive that, it may be 3 or 4 or 5%. Okay, but if you apply that 28% in a tight band and it's cooler, all right, and it's getting in contact with the soil, it may be closer to 1%. So again, how you do that, if you put, let's say we put on 30 gallons of 28%, that's 90 pounds. We're worried about 45 pounds of that being available to hydrolyze. So if it's a day, maybe we lose 2 or 3 pounds in a given day, but that's why we stabilize, in order to give us time to get rainfall, to get in contact with soil, so we don't volatilize it off. So we've talked about 3 different ways we lose nitrogen. Denitrification, all right? So things like wet soils, compaction, warm temps, residue level, and the reason I have residue level there is that drives the microorganisms that break down that residue. They need oxygen, and so if you plow down a lot of residue and you have a lot of organisms down there, and then you get waterlogged soils, that means there's more of those organisms needing oxygen. All right, they'll take that oxygen from your nitrate molecule. So urea hydrolysis, all right, talked about that. And then leaching is, so the nitrate molecule is negatively charged, your soil is negatively charged. So if you have a real well-drained, coarse textured soil and you get a lot of rain, you can move a lot of nitrate very, very quickly down through the soil profile. So that's how it's lost. And then as it concerns leaching, all I would tell you is I've seen a lot of data here in the last couple of years, and I'm being pretty conservative here. We can move a lot, and when I say a lot, like 50 to 100 pounds, a 4-inch rainfall can move 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen down very, very quickly through your soil profile. And the reason I bring that up is that's why it's so important to regulate the amount of nitrates that are available at any one time in your field. Because if you think about it, if you put all your nitrogen on at planting and we get it converted, let's say in 6 weeks, and it's sitting there in a nitrate form, and we have a 6-inch rainfall, and you have so say you have a 6-inch corn plant, all right, you have a well-drained soil, you're going to move that nitrate very, very quickly down through your soil profile, and it's going to be a while for your corn plants to get to it, if they ever do, depending on what happens with rain. So that's why it's important to control the amount of nitrates that are available over the course of the year, and you can control it by when you put it on, how much you put it on, and what you do as it relates to a stabilizer. So, all right, let's go on. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about mineralization and immobilization now, because it's very important as we think about this process. So mineralization is a biological process that releases organic N from your soil organic matter. It is a biological process, and it's highly affected. Again, these are organisms, so temperature, moisture, pH, and oxygen. So in a good mineralization year, we can get 10 to 25 pounds of nitrogen for each % of organic matter in an acre furrow slice. Okay, so this is highly impacted by residue in the previous crop, and this is really what I want to hit on and have you think about. Let's go to the next one. So I want to talk to you a little bit about mineralization and immobilization. Okay. So as we think about this is a process that goes on in your soils at all time. Nature is always seeking a balance, okay? And whether you drive mineralization or release of nitrogen into your soil versus immobilization or tying up nitrogen in your soil, a big part of that is the carbon-nitrogen ratio in your soils, all right? So the balance point or break even is somewhere around 25 to 1. So if you have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, all right, you will drive mineralization or release of organic nitrogen. If you have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, that will drive immobilization or tying up of the organic nitrogen. And that's where previous crop will really impact what's going on in your soils. Here's just a different visual to look so you can see. So again, if you have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, somewhere in that 25 to 1, all right, is the right number, you'll drive mineralization or release. But if you have high carbon to nitrogen ratios in your soil, all right, what happens is you build up organisms that have to break that residue down, and those organisms need nitrogen as food, so they will chew up, as they're building up and chew up your residue, they will take your nitrogen temporarily, all right, for their food to break down your residue. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So 1 ton of residue, this is corn residue, all right, requires about 30 pounds. Let's talk about corn. So a ton of residue requires about 30 pounds of nitrogen to decompose it, all right? Now, corn residue already contains about 15 pounds of nitrogen, so you need about another 15 pounds from somewhere, right? Those organisms that are going to break your residue down, they need about 15 pounds of nitrogen to break that residue down. Now, if you look at those numbers, that's a rough estimate. I mean, trust me, it's not an exact science, but if you grew 215 bushel corn, you're going to be plowing down around 6 tons of dry matter, all right? Well, 6 times 15, all right, because that's how much additional nitrogen is needed. Somewhere, somehow, you got to supply about 90 pounds of nitrogen additional, right? 6 times 15 is 90 to break that residue down. And this is that carbon-nitrogen ratio that we're talking about. And it's really important as you think about managing residue as it relates to immobilization or mineralization. Here's I stole this slide from BASF with their permission. And on the left, which you got fall chiseling, and then what they did is they applied different rates, okay, of nitrogen. And then on the right is spring. All right, so same thing, different rates. And here's the interesting thing. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Don't have to dig into it too deeply, right? But in the fall, when they worked that residue down, all right, that mineralization process had already, so look at the difference between left and right. Okay, the left set and the right set. You can see the left is much healthier. Well, the reason is, right, the fall chiseling allowed some of that mineralization and breakdown to occur in the fall, and therefore not as much nitrogen was tied up in the spring versus the spring chiseling. When they worked that residue in, those populations build up in the spring and they tied up more nitrogen in the spring. This is why, by the way, some guys do what they can to feed the microorganisms in the fall. Sometimes it's with a biological product, sometimes it's with simple 28. What they're trying to do is basically pay some of the penalty, all right, of those the microorganisms break this residue down in the fall, so that not so much of it is tied up in the spring. Hope that makes sense. In other words, they're getting some of this residue mineralized in the fall instead of all of it happening in the spring. That's this concept of the carbon penalty, immobilization versus mineralization. So what are some standard carbon-nitrogen ratios, right? I said that break-even was around 25:1. And there you can see soybean residue is right around there, right? So if you plow down alfalfa, see, alfalfa has a real low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So as it's mineralized, those microorganisms, they don't have to take any more nitrogen to break it down. In fact, when they break it down, because it has a low carbon nitrogen ratio, they're releasing it or mineralizing nitrogen to you. Same with soybean residue. Okay, that's where we talk about soybean credits for following soybeans. It's because of the carbon to nitrogen ratio and the mineralization that occurs as the residues break down. Same way with manure, topsoil. Now, when you plow down corn stalks or small grains, right, it has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when you plow it down, mix it in the soil, right, it takes additional nitrogen to break it down. So you're paying a penalty in order to do that. So that's why I always tell guys, and most of you are aware of that, right, that when you work in residue, you need to pay we'll call it a carbon penalty fee in order to get those organisms to break it down quicker, so they're not tying up nitrogen that you applied that should be going to your crop. Okay? So residue, as we think about the mineralization, immobilization, and carbon-nitrogen ratio process, anything that we can do to help break down this residue is really, really important. That's why we came out with chain roll, right? That's a picture of a chained corn stalk. So a lot of things can impact how quickly that residue breaks down, which will impact how quickly or how slowly your nitrogen is released back into your soil when it's mineralized. So temperature, pH, the size of the residue, or if it's chained like this, moisture or lack thereof, oxygen or lack thereof, and food source. Food source is nitrogen, right? So if you can do things to your residue to open it up, allow oxygen in there, provide a food source, all those things will help oxidize, mineralize this residue more quickly and reduce the carbon penalty or the immobilization that goes onto your soil. Okay? So mineralization, again, is impacted by the size of the residue, the tillage system, the environment, and the microbial food. There's a picture you can see of two different stalks, and basically it's just a matter of one was handled differently, was physically by a chain roll. You can see how much more quickly it's breaking down because it's getting oxygen and moisture and more quickly into that soil. So that is the nitrogen story in a nutshell. Well, good. Listen, that's part one. There's going to be 4 more parts of this. Some of it will be brand new, I promise. There won't be a repeat of this story. Some of it will be repeating maybe the story about stabilizers, things like that. But we're going to go through this. If you have questions, feel free to email me, talk to your RAM. It's important, we think, to just continue to review this because it's so relevant to what we're doing at 360. Really, we're trying to figure out how do we manage nitrates, how do we manage the supply and the timing such that we grow more corn without getting more nitrates in the groundwater. And that's really the concept we're focused on. So
we have a question here that says, does immobilization from heavy corn residue have any effect on soybeans?
On soybeans? So that's actually a great question. So, and it is a fascinating question. So good question. Here's the thing. Soybeans, it is believed, right, that once you get above, I'll say 65 to 68 bushel soybeans, that the soybean plant's ability to fix its own nitrogen, right, becomes limited. And so therefore the soybean plant has to supplement its nitrogen supply from organic forms. Okay, it's not clearly understood. It's not well known. We've done tons of research on applying supplemental N, and the reason that again, the reason we've tried these tests is because we're like, gosh, we know that soybean needs additional N, and therefore let's supply it. To the question of does immobilization affect soybeans, because the soybean starts nodulating fairly early, especially if you use an inoculant, it has the ability to supply the majority of the nitrogen it needs through nodulation pretty much up until, and that's by the way why we try those nitrogen applications at R2, R3 stage, because that's where we think we know that's the real high uptake phase is. By that time, by that R2, R1 stage, there's more than likely been quite a bit of mineralization in many years, and there's been enough of that residue broken down at that time that we don't really believe that the immobilization, the tie-up of nitrogen that goes into the corn, breaking down the corn residue in soybeans, will impact the soybean crop at all. We think there's enough, and by that R2 stage, it started to actually reverse itself, and as those microorganisms break down, after they break down the corn residue, they die off, they start releasing that nitrogen back into the crop. So therefore, no, it's a great question, and I say no, we don't think so. Pretty sure that because of the nodulation, it supplies its needs, and you have mineralization going on, and those organisms will grab the mineralized in from the organic matter to feed themselves as well, that by the time it gets to that R2, R3 stage, we don't feel like it really has an impact. And I would tell you, we've tried a number of trials to supplement in soybeans, and it's a hit and miss. It's really, really hit and miss whether or not we see returns. So, great question. What rate of UAN is necessary to start off a corn crop with previous corn crop and fall tillage on 4%? Oh, great question. Okay, here's the question. Let me read it to you. What rate of 28% or UAN solution is necessary to start off a corn crop with a previous corn crop and fall tillage on 4% organic matter soils? Okay, here's how I would answer that question. So let's go back, and it depends a little bit on the amount of residue. It depends a little bit on, think about that mineralization process. So let's say you're able to work that residue in third week of September, and let's say it's been a really warm fall. We've had good moisture levels, and let's say it's like this fall. Let's just say this fall where it was very, very warm into the end of November, December. Well, you've had probably 2 good months, right, where the organisms were able to start breaking that residue down. So now flash back to that chart I showed you where we said, say 200 bushel corn crop needs about an additional 90 pounds, right, of nitrogen to break it down. Well, I will tell you, I've seen some data this fall where we were mineralizing because of the good conditions. We were mineralizing organic nitrogen late into the year, August, September. So there was some organic nitrogen available for those organisms, maybe in a little bit left over as well from what we applied, and they were breaking that residue down. So, long-winded answer to your question, what I would recommend if you're next spring and you're applying UAN, you have 4% organic matter soil, depending on what, now, let me back up a little bit. If you plowed that residue down last week, that's a different story. You're going to need more in the spring to help break down. But I would tell you, in my opinion, in the spring, if you want to pay that carbon penalty by applying additional UAN in the spring, okay, fall tillage, I'm going to tell you I would put probably 40 to 50 pounds additional on in the spring to help feed the organisms to break that residue down. If you plowed that residue down last week and we didn't have a lot of mineralization, okay, go back to that BASF chart, right? That's kind of the difference. Then maybe it's more like 55, 60 pounds. And again, it's a matter of timing, right? It doesn't mean you have to put more down. It just means you have to shift more of the applied end to the front side of your growing season to pay that penalty so that you're not starving the corn plant. Hope that. And again, the other thing I would tell you is think about the uptake curve. It's not like we need huge amounts of nitrogen early in that corn plant's life. So in that 40 to 60 pound range is probably going to be enough many, many years. And I hate to say this, but it kind of depends on the growing season as well. Okay, question. Are there any biologicals that help break down residue and or help slow the process of nitrogen converting to nitrate? And the answer is yes. There are, and I will tell you, I think, for those of you who know, I've 32 years in the industry. Most of all that's been in the seed business. And I have watched the biological arena explode in the last 5 years, and it is an arena that will continue to develop and mature and grow. There are a number of biologicals that are available that you can apply. I'm not going to mention because there's so many and I'll forget them. But there are a number of biological products that you can actually spray on the residue, all right, to help break that residue down more quickly. Okay. Now keep in mind, right, that still is a biological process. So if your residue is broken up, if it's if it's fractured, if you have good temperature, good moisture, good pHs, and you apply that biological, that will speed the process up. But if you apply the biological and the next week it turns off 30 degrees, all right, it won't really help nearly as much. Now, it'll help maybe back in the spring again. But yes, there are biologicals. And to your question about nitrification biologicals, there are some products coming out that can do that as well. And we will continue to see new products emerge on the market that will do that. So yes, there are, and I think that market will continue to explode over time. Absolutely. Let's see, another question. Common practice in my area is to weed and feed 60 pounds of 28 behind the plant and supply into the corn until side dress. How much is lost from all forms of N by the time the plant can actually start using it? Okay, great question. Let me read it again. Weed and feed 60 pounds. So about 20 gallon, 28 behind the planter to supply into the corn until side dress. How much is lost from all forms of N by the time the plant actually starts using it? Here's how I'd answer that question. So let's go back to that description we talked about. So weed and feed is very spread out, right? If you're spraying it, so it's dilute. If it's it depends if it's corn after beans versus corn after corn. If it's corn after beans, and let's say, I'll give you a worst case scenario. Let's say you spray it. Did you work it in? Weed and feed. Let's pretend you work it in. If you work it in, all right, that 20 pounds is in contact with soil almost instantly, and you're not going to lose much to hydrolysis or volatilization, right? And so what happens? So your question was the other forms. That kind of depends, right? It depends on how much rainfall you get. So go back, urea, ammonium nitrate, 25% is nitrate, 50% urea, and 50% is ammonium. The 50% that is urea, let's say it works it in and gets in contact with soil, or let's say you spray it on and you get a quarter to a half inch of rain 2 days later. Well, we're not going to lose much to the urea hydrolysis because we got it in contact with soil. The ammonium's not going anywhere. And remember, the urea molecule converts to ammonium, so 75% of that is going to be in the ammonium form, held by our soil pretty well, and then it has to go through the nitrification process. The other part is the 25% that's in the nitrate form. So that nitrate is available to be taken up, but it's also available to be denitrified or leached, right? So if let's say you have 5-inch rainfall, all right, you'll move some of that nitrate down through the zone, right? Or if you have a poorly drained soil, depending on where you're at in Southwest Ohio, there's some heavier clay soils down there, obviously. You might, depending on temperature, pH, things like that, you can denitrify some of that pretty quickly. So it's kind of, there's so many variables that impact your question. I would tell you, now, let me go back. Let's say you spray a weed and feed and it doesn't rain. You have a weird spring and it turns off in 90 degrees and none of the urea gets in contact with the soil, or very limited amount gets in contact with the soil. You're going to lose, and let's say you have a real high pH on the surface, you're going to lose 2 to 3%. So if 60 pounds of 28, 30% of that's the urea form, you're going to lose, you'll lose 1 to 2% of that 30 pounds, all right, every day. So if it's 3%, so that's about a pound a day, right? That it doesn't get in contact with the soil. So it's hard. It's one of those things where you almost have to, you can lose, the answer to your question is you might lose very little, or you might lose a fair amount of it, depending on if you work it in, depending on if it's hot and dry, cold and wet, heavy rainfall. It kind of depends on the growing season. Sorry, it's hard to. It's one of those things where call me after you do it, and I can actually make predictions. And that's why, by the way, a lot of the models that are out there, they're starting to really incorporate high levels of these variables in their algorithms to help start doing some predictive analysis of these types of scenarios. They'll start measuring temperature and moisture and rainfall and things like that, and start. You could construct some algorithms, start making those calculations. So that's a very long-winded answer that doesn't really answer your question. Sorry. All right. Well, the next one we'll spend some time digging into stabilizers, the types, the forms, when to use them, how to use them, and hopefully that'll answer some more questions. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate it very much. Have a great day. We will be talking to you later.